We'll give your legs and your voice a bit of a break, but I also want to invite you to jump in at any point in this presentation. I also just want to say, what's your name? Kenzie? Yeah. Like, I thought it was really interesting that book, Stroke of Insight, framed the stroke in a positive way. And when I think about my Mormon upbringing, and when I think about the way that I dealt with my faith crisis, it was to hyper-perform as an activist to try and, try and help others and to convert my pain and my grief into serving others and to trying to solve the problem. But what Margie and my kids will tell you that for at least the first 10 years of Mormon Stories, my work with Mormon Stories could have been conceived as avoidance and running from the healing that I needed to do. And I can say that one of the most painful hours of my life was when I attended with Margie a Quaker service in Logan as we were church shopping after we had been kicked out. And the Quaker church service was to sit for an hour in silence. And that was the most painful hour probably of my life. And not because I have to be talking, but because to just sit there and there's no phone, there's no stimuli, I'm not talking, but I'm also not learning and listening. That was excruciating. And when you read Buddhism, secular Buddhism, Eckhart Tolle, and you learn about the importance of mindfulness and contact with the present moment, you realize that if you ever want to make progress away from unhealthy lifestyles and towards something more healthy, learning to just observe your thoughts, be in the moment, not be doing, but just be content being in the moment that is around you, as Stephen likes to say, getting in touch with your body, learning to listen to your body. That's really hard stuff for me. And I don't want to explain you into telling you what a gift of an experience you had, but I can say I'm a little bit envious. I would love to be forced to kind of learn to be okay in silence for a while. And maybe I need to do mushrooms or whatever, or take some time off of Mormon Stories and retrain my brain to be comfortable in the present moment.
You don't need mushrooms.
I know, I was joking. But thank you for sharing. Okay, really quick, I'm ready to jump into the next section, communicating. We've only got 2 hours left. Isn't that a crime?
No.
For me, it's a crime.
I think it's been a very full day so far.
Oh, yeah?
Have you enjoyed it? Has it been helpful? I think it's been incredible.
I like that reframe. So, how's the feedback with Steve's microphone? Okay, will you turn your microphone off, and then whenever you want to jump in, just turn it back on and then turn it off again. Is that okay? Just because there's feedback coming. Is that better? Okay. Does he need to sit somewhere else? Would that be better if he sat somewhere else? Okay. Okay, and I'll remind you if you forget to turn on. But I do want you to please jump in at any point. Is that okay? Okay, you will. He will. Okay, really quickly, I want to begin by, without microphones, I want 20 of you to, in 1 to 2 sentences, maybe one sentence, share with me the person or the scenario of the believer that you're here to learn how to communicate with better. All right, so let's go. Just shout it, stand up and shout it out really loud. Returned missionary son. Okay, who else? 15-year-old believing daughter, okay? Believing dad who's a bishop, okay?
My wife who doesn't believe in truth claims but finds community and wants some kids to have that community as well.
A wife who doesn't believe in the truth claims but wants the kids to have community and identity.
My husband who does believe in the truth claims no matter what I show him.
Husband who believes, those are really key words here. Husband who believes in the truth claims no matter what she shows them. Okay, what else? In the back, loud. Mother who retired from BYU. Okay, other scenarios? Wife like who won't listen to what you have to teach her no matter what. Okay, any others? Teenage stepkids, that's a challenge. Yes? Siblings, believing siblings. Son who works for the church. brother who she helped teach, okay? Provo neighbors. All right, hat in the back. Believing mother in the basement. Beautiful. Yellow sweater, sweatshirt. Oh my goodness. Did you guys hear that? A believing mother who's been asking God to kill her, believing that maybe by her death it will bring her daughter back to faith. Man in blue shirt in the back. In a divorce, children are surrounded by believing members and a believing ex-wife, and you're the non-believing dad who's not living with the kids. How do you have influence with your children when you feel like everyone else surrounding them is believing? Yes, ma'am. Mother who is addicted to genealogy work. Good. Do I come out publicly? And if so, how? And gentlemen in the shirt, the last one. Yes, very good. Grandpa wants to teach his grandchildren critical thinking without making his children want to take the grandchildren away from him and not have access to him because he's scary and dangerous teaching critical thinking tools, which are not always things that parents want their children to have necessarily. Very, very good. All right, give everyone a round of applause. Okay, so we're going to try and cover a lot in an hour. And the first concept that I want to share with you is from, I think he's a social psychologist named Jonathan Haidt. That's H-A-I-D-T. He's out of, I believe, the University of Virginia. Maybe you know more about Jonathan Haidt than me. He wrote a book called The Righteous Mind, and there's a really cool metaphor in The Righteous Mind that I think everybody needs to understand. And if you've heard me talk about this before, I apologize, but hopefully maybe some repetition will be helpful. Jonathan Haidt likes to liken the brain to a rider, a human rider on an elephant. And there's two parts of the brain that he's kind of referring to when he talks about the rider and the elephant. The rider, the human sitting on top of the elephant, represents your cerebral frontal cortex, your most advanced part of your brain, the logical brain, the part of your brain that is in charge of executive functioning and decision making. That's actually, in terms of evolution, the latest, the most recent part of the brain that developed that in many ways differentiates us as humans from other animals, okay? The other part of the brain that is represented in this metaphor is the amygdala, the emotional center, the monkey brain, the lizard brain, the emotional brain, as it's called. And he helps us realize that the brain works a lot like this. And obviously it's an oversimplification. But when things are calm, when somebody doesn't feel threatened, when people feel safe, right? Then if the rider is riding with the elephant and the rider wants to steer the elephant where the rider wants to go, in other words, when the logic self wants to be fully activated and steer and guide the brain where it wants to go, it's possible. So in spite of the fact that the elephant's way bigger, way stronger, way heavier, when everything's calm and everything's cool and everyone feels safe, the rider can be a little bit more in control, okay? That's how the brain works. That's how reason and logic can work with the brain. However, when the person gets startled, when a mouse or a lion or some type of threat confronts the rider on the elephant and the elephant gets scared and the rider wants to go in one direction and the elephant wants to go in another direction, who wins? The elephant wins every time. The emotion, the amygdala, the emotional center of the brain, is in the center of the brain. It literally has more power when push comes to shove than the rational brain. You've heard about fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. There's probably other adjectives there. But the point is, when you get triggered, you have evolved such that when you get afraid, when you're hunting on the savannah and you hear a rustling in the bushes and you start to believe that a lion's coming after you to eat you, is it your logical brain that kicks in and says, I wonder whether I should hang out and try and reason with the lion, or maybe I'll grab a bite to eat? No, it's your emotional center that gets triggered and takes over and wants to either fight or run or freeze, right? Depending on whatever seems most safe at the time. And that's how the brain generally works, okay? The emotion center wins every time. Now here's the trick. We like to think, this is what Jonathan Haidt teaches, we like to think that we are rational, logical creatures. And in many ways, we can be. But the truth is, what Jonathan Haidt has helped demonstrate is that often humans actually arrive at their decisions emotionally first. What feels good, what feels right, what feels safe, what makes me feel loved, what feels familiar to me, what's going to get me the best love from my parents, what's going to make me safest in my community, what's going to make me feel comfortable and safe in the world. They start out with how they feel, and then they use logic to justify the conclusion that they arrived at emotionally, thinking that they arrived at that decision logically. And that's how the brain fools us. And so when you're thinking about communicating with believing family and friends, you have to realize that emotions generally tend to rule. And so there's a saying that I like to say that some of you may have heard me say before. This is not original to me, but the idea is you can't reason someone out of a position that they arrived at emotionally. And do people gain their Mormon testimony through reason and logic generally? How do people get converted to Mormonism, whether they were born and raised in the church or whether they're converts? Shout it out. How do they gain their testimony? Burning in the bosom, which is emotion, right? What else? Holy Ghost, what? The Spirit, right? Their parents, they get up and bear their testimony, and the parents pat them on the back and reassure them. They're on their mission, and they're getting all sorts of kudos and accolades from their friends. They're at youth conference or EFY, and they bear their testimony, and everyone around them says how much they love and approve of them, right? Conversion is generally an emotional experience. And so that's the first thing you have to realize when you're communicating with believing family and friends. Their position is emotional, primarily emotional, and that's why so many of you think, I just need to show them the CES letter. If I could just get them to listen to the Tom Phillips or the Robert Rittner episodes on Mormon Stories podcast, if they'll just hear the LDS Discussions episode on Joseph Smith's failed revelations, it'll be obvious to them that the church isn't true, right? But what's the flaw in logic? What's the flaw? Their position is emotional, right? So already there are a couple of you that shouted out, why won't my spouse or why won't my kids or why won't my parents learn the things that I've learned? And the answer is because they're terrified. Because their identity, their morality, their spirituality, their community, their friendships, their occupation, in some cases 50, 60, 70 years of their lives have been invested with the sunk cost fallacy in their identity. And who at 40 or 50 or 60 wants to consciously decide to completely disorient and throw their entire life into chaos? You're raising your hand. You do? Well, clearly we do, or we wouldn't be here. But that's why you can't use CES letter or church history or LGBT issues or whatever as billy clubs to try and bludgeon your believing family and friends into seeing your worldview. Guess what? You didn't see it until you were ready. And the point that often we forget is sometimes we think that it was learning something that got us out of the church. But the truth is, if we were really to do a scientific analysis of loss of faith, I think many of you would find that an emotional disruption in your Mormon experience predated your intellectual disaffection from the church. Whether it's you weren't happy, you were feeling worn out, you were feeling like you weren't good enough, your marriage wasn't working, life wasn't turning out like you thought, you saw someone else that you loved being hurt in that scenario, and it was the emotional feelings about something not being right that actually ripened your willingness to all of a sudden start learning. Because guess what? Before the CES letter and before LDS discussions was Mormon Stories. And before that was Sunstone. And before that was Dialogue. And before that was the Tanners. And before that was Fawn Brody. Fawn Brody's book's been here since 1945. The information's always been there. Why didn't you know about it? One answer is you weren't ready. And until you're emotionally ready to start asking questions, your defenses are gonna be up. So that's the first thing I want you all to remember when communicating with believing family and friends, is that emotion is almost always going to trump logic and reason. I'm gonna pause. Would you like to add anything to this so far?
No, I agree with everything you've said, and I would just add that tuning in a respectful way to be curious and interested, and if anything, inquisitive, and asking a question and another question because you want to step into that person's shoes and get them to articulate their thoughts and their feelings is a really powerful technique to do. But you also have to be willing to listen and repeat back to them what they're saying, but not be formulaic, be really present on a human level.
Love that. So that's a technique of how to have these conversations. And we're going to definitely make sure and try and cover that before the end of this presentation. Quick question or comment?
I was just going to add to that having that conversation where you listen to another person and their experience, and you see if you can validate it or that you understand it, you validate it, then I think sometimes it helps to just let a few days go by where the conversation is just about them at that time, rather than you also trying to say, well, okay, I hear what you're saying, and this is what I'm saying. You know, it just let a couple days go by.
Yeah, if I can add, you know, people get in over time, and it takes time and a process to reevaluate. And what came to mind just now as I was listening to what you were just saying, I often with my clients, when they're feeling overwhelmed, I ask them the question, if someone handed you a 40-pound watermelon, how would you eat it? You have to cut it into smaller pieces, and you don't eat the rind, but don't try to eat it all in one sitting. So like break it down into small pieces, and I talk to my clients about rapport and trust building, because a lot of, when I was hearing everybody talking earlier, I felt kind of like they needed to do damage control first to rebuild a relationship where their loved ones weren't already waiting to do battle, to build rapport and trust, and in order to do a piece-by-piece approach.
Beautiful, thank you, Stephen. Okay, next concept I wanted to share with you is the following. If you liken a faith crisis in your family to a bunch of people being in a boat, right? To being in a canoe. We're gonna talk about the backfire effect for a second. And I apologize if you guys have already heard a lot about the backfire effect, but I wanna make sure everybody's kind of on the same page. Let's just say that you're all in a boat and there's sharks swimming around. in the waters, and you know that it's not safe to fall out of the boat. And all of a sudden, one person stands up in the boat and starts flailing their arms and shaking the boat and causing a huge disruption where you become terrified that the boat's going to capsize and you're all going to get eaten, right? What is the natural reaction of the people who are still in the boat to the person standing up and freaking out and destabilizing the boat? What is it? Arms out? What else? Go lower, right? Don't you go lower? You spread out and you go lower and you hold on tighter. Is that not right? That's what happens when somebody is destabilizing the boat. Well, life is an intricate system of people and thoughts and feelings and stories and relationships. And when you lose your faith, right, and you start saying, hey, Joseph Smith's a sexual predator, and the Book of Mormon that you love is a total fraud, and you've based your entire life on a lie, that's like standing up and destabilizing what everybody is experiencing in the boat. It's terrifying, right? And the point is the more rabid you are, the more animated you are, the more excited you are, the more afraid they're going to be, the lower they're going to get, and the more tightly they're going to hold on. And that's called the backfire effect, okay? So, we all do it wrong because we're so traumatized, we're so angry, and sometimes we're so full of joy at the truth and the beauty that we've discovered that we want to share it with everybody we love, just like the tree of life and the fruit. It's like, oh, I've partaken of this beautiful fruit of ex-Mormonism, and I want to share it with everybody, right? And our joy can still be traumatizing and terrifying to the people in the boat, right? So, what's your option then if it's not to scream and yell and try and force your life experience into their face? What other alternative do you have? What do you have? Okay, living your example. Express your emotions. Shout some things out. Love them. Okay, accept them. Okay, so Stephen Hassan has a really important story that he kind of shared with you, but I want him to slow down and tell you a really important part. And I want you to talk about the part of your sister and the role she played in your being able to see the Moonies more clearly for the first time, and what it was about your sister and your relationship with your sister that allowed some light to get through for you. Would you mind sharing that?
Do you want me to come up front?
Please.
Or can I be
yeah,
here?
You can do whatever you want.
Is it okay to be here? No, of all my family and friends, when I got into the Moonies and dropped out of college, they all freaked out and they all tried to yell at me and argue me out of it and tell me I was in a cult and I was brainwashed, which I interpreted as persecution by Satan. And my sister was the only person who just said, I love you and I don't understand and I miss you. And so she was the safest of anybody at that point where my mind was starting to reconnect to my authentic self to reach out to. And when I do work with families, I'm always looking in a family system. It could be an aunt, an uncle, a grandfather, grandmother, next door neighbor that can be that person in the member's life that is safe, so that if they are ready to talk or ask questions, and that person can even say, you know, if you ever want to talk confidentially, I'm here for you, I'll listen to you. And listening is the key point about that. That said, I'll also add, my sister guilt-tripped me a bit by saying, you have a nephew that you haven't met, and I want him to know his Uncle Stevie, and you know, he's so cute, you should come and visit him. And then I made her promise not to tell my parents, because they were evil, and she broke her promise, which was, she said, the scariest thing she ever did, because she knew she would lose me, you know, if it didn't work out. It was a big, high risk. But she said, I know you, and that wasn't you. Like in her mind, she felt like there was no option, because she did love me, to try to help me get out of it.
Beautiful. Thank you for sharing that, Steve. That's a really powerful story. Thank you. The number one piece of advice I have for you in relation to your believing family and friends is make them feel safe. Love them unconditionally. Show them the type of love that you want. You don't want to be loved if you continue believing in the church and going to church. Is that love? No. Well, guess what? They don't want to be loved if and only if they listen to your CES letter rants, or listen to your favorite Mormon Stories podcast episodes, or come to view the world like you view it. That's unconditional love, and nobody wants to be loved that way. And certainly you don't want to model unhealthy love. You want to model for them the love that you want to receive. And so my number one piece of advice to you is show them unconditional love and go overboard to make them feel safe, right? In other words, imagine the flip. Imagine that if this person were to sit down in the boat, get really, really low, and maybe even, put some anchors down so that the boat feels very, very safe and stable. If that person were to stabilize the boat and everybody felt like the boat was rock solid and safe, what do you think the other people might do? Relax. And what? Maybe even move around a bit, or maybe even get up on their knees, and maybe even play around with standing up, right? Because they feel like the boat is safe. And I'm not saying do it in a sneaky way because you want to make them feel safe so that they'll want to leave. Like, honestly, I believe that everybody should have the right to self-determination, and that's got to be everyone's personal journey. But what I am going to say is, if you go overboard and you say, let's say you're a grandparent, right? Let's say you're a grandparent and you're worried about your grandkids. I promise you, shouldn't promise you, my professional opinion is that if you were to say to your children, hey, I just want to let you know something. I want you to know, child-in-law, that I respect your religious beliefs. And even though you and I see faith differently, I want you to know that your children are safe with me. I'm never going to do anything to try and take away your children's faith, pick at your children's faith. They are going to be safe, and I'm going to be supportive of whatever journeys they want to have, and I'm never going to do anything to try and contradict your roles and responsibilities as a parent. Now, that may seem like the last thing you want to do as a grandparent, but what I learned from Shefali Sayberry about parenting is your biggest power as a parent is influence. But if they're afraid of you, you have no influence. In fact, if they're afraid of you, they cut you out. So what you want to do over time is build in these believing family members a feeling of safety, like you are just there to love them on their journey. And you're never going to try and mess with their job as parent and try and take their kids away. And over time, you're going to maintain influence and true love with them that I promise you will bear positive fruits. And if it doesn't lead to them eventually being open to leaving the church, worst case, you have a great relationship with your kids and grandkids, and you haven't made them want to cut you off and keep your grandchildren from you, which is what so many ex-Mormons can do when they're angry and frustrated and panicky, or spouses, frankly, or ex-spouses, like dealing with it, it's so easy to ruin those relationships where you have no influence whatsoever. So make them feel safe. Is that all right? Okay, quick question. Let's get you a microphone. Do you have a mic? Can I borrow that mic just as early?
I want it back.
Oh yeah, of course.
Thank you. So I feel like I have a lot of the resources to deal with like setting boundaries with my family and respectfully having dialogue and those kinds of things. My questions around like having relationships with believing loved ones deal more with disappointment and their disappointment in me, right? Because I understand I can go make new communities and have other support systems that do celebrate with me on big days. But someday, you know, when I get married, it's not gonna be in a temple. And that's something that makes me really happy, but it's gonna really disappoint my parents, right? And my mom's still my mom at the end of the day. And so I guess as far as relationships go, how do you cope with the fact that things that are gonna make you really happy in your life are going to be a major source of disappointment for the people you love?
Can we have applause for that vulnerable question? That's a beautiful question. Okay, I'm a bit of a linear thinker, so Steve, is there anything you wanted to react to the previous comments I was making? And then we're gonna come right to the topic of disappointment. But let's rewind a bit to the topic of making them safe.
Yes, so I in principle agree with what you're saying, and I have a different approach or different angle to suggest considering, but please know he has more experience with Mormons than I do, so you need to just hear what I have to say and then apply what makes sense to you. But for me, I think modeling being an honest, good person who's in touch with their thoughts and their feelings and their bodies, especially if you're a relative, grandparent or whatever, that's always going to be very influential. And sharing life stories, I would also add with the stabilizing the boat, bringing up memories, positive memories with loved ones where you did happy things together, adventures, skiing, other types of memories is always good. And saying over and over again how much I love you, or I'm so glad that you're my mom or you're my dad, if you can believe that. If you don't believe it, don't say it, because that's not true. I'm a little leery about encouraging people to verbalize reinforcing the group beliefs unless they're being asked. Like, for me to let you near my kids, I need you to promise me not to bring up critical things. Then that becomes a contract that's negotiated. But I'm nervous about, because again, thinking they may get out one day, you don't want them to say back to you, why didn't you tell me if you knew there were real problems? You know, I looked up to you and I trusted you. So that's a little bit trickier. There are safe, non-controversial subjects that I believe parents, grandparents, siblings can share with one another. And one thing that I really like a lot is Phil Zimbardo's Heroic Imagination Project. Has anyone heard of Philip Zimbardo or the Zimbardo Prison Study? No? Yes, one person, 2 people, 3 people. I don't want to get off on the Zimbardo Prison Study. I have interviews with him. But the heroicimagination.org is a curriculum aimed for schools where they take small videos of different social psychology lessons with a curriculum of questions. And the idea is to educate young people and old people how much we are socially influenced by others, and with the goal of empowering them to be good citizens. Now, disclosure, at the very end, there's a module on cults, so you may not want to go the whole route with them. But for example, the Ash Conformity Study, the Milgram Obedience Study, etc., these are going to be just like scientific studies, and that one can begin to cultivate an education about how much we can be influenced by one another. So I think that's really valuable. And if I may respond to that woman, it's not exactly linear. But heroicimagination.org. So I may not remember exactly what you just said about not going to be married in the temple and all that. But a principle of communication is always recommended that you're being a good listener to the point where you can repeat back to the person what they said with the same affect and appreciating that you heard them. I understand, Mom, that you really want me to do X, Y, and Z, and you believe, based on what you've taught, that this needs to happen, and this needs to happen, and this needs to happen. And then you pause, and then you say, and I love you very, very much, you know that. Pause, and I'm really having a struggle because I want to please you, and I want you to love me, and I want to be part of your life, and I also need to follow my truth, or I need to follow God, or I need to do what I believe I need to do, but I don't know how to negotiate that with you. But at least you're putting it on the table in a non-emotional, reactive way. Pardon me. But for me, kind of really making them feel validated, that you heard them, acknowledging the strengths, and then saying, I have a dilemma. And there's a part of me that would love to just do what you're asking me to do, but I would really feel like it would be betraying my love of God or Jesus or whatever it feels right for you. And that opens a crack in the door for consideration. The other thing you could say is, as I want to step into your shoes and really understand your position, could you please do your best to step into my shoes and understand where I'm coming from? And again, that's about communication techniques. So that's what I wanted to share.
Well, thank you, Steve. That was really good. Yeah. I love that. Just one sec. I love that technique. I love those pauses. And I love the idea of reflecting back to them what you heard them say, because then they have to listen to what they said and actually think about it and think about the implications while they're staring you in the eyes. I love the fact that you're modeling love and connection and expressing how important the relationship is to you, and that you even have a desire to please them, but at the same time, you're then going back to your values and saying, I value truth, or I value integrity, or this is what's feeling right for me. Because one of the fundamental principles of Mormonism is free agency, right? And so that's a principle, that's a principle that they can relate to, and if they really believe in that part of Mormon doctrine, that's going to cause a little bit of cognitive dissonance for them. Go ahead.
You definitely want to quote that.
Tell us what you mean.
If there are doctrines from the group, like we believe in free agency, you're speaking to their cult indoctrinated self. They're going to have to agree. Well, absolutely.
Yeah, that's good.
And such. So that's really valuable. There was one other piece I wanted to add, and I think I lost.
We'll come right back to it. Let me. Okay, so let me go ahead and share my response to that question, and then we can come right back. Okay, so there's this notion called the Nephi effect. How many of you have heard me talk about the Nephi effect before? Okay, a few of you. So one of the negative stereotypes, the false stereotypes about ex-Mormons, is that they were weak. They wanted to sin, right? They never really believed to begin with, right? My experience with the people that I work with is that these are the zone leaders and the APs and the sister leaders on the mission who are leaving the church over the issues that they're leaving the church over. These are Relief Society presidency members, young women's leaders, young men's leaders, bishopric members, stake Relief Society presidency and primary members, even members of stake presidencies and stake high councilmen. Raise your hand if you have served in any of the callings that I just mentioned, right? In other words, what Marlon Jensen once said, who was our church historian and general authority, he said, we're losing our best and our brightest. That's what Marlon Jensen said once he started digging into the faith crisis stuff. So our problem, tell me if you relate to this, our problem is that we didn't believe too weakly or too feebly. Our problem was we took it too seriously and believed it too much. How many of you relate to that? Right? Okay. So what I call, how many of you identified, I apologize that within Mormonism, there's no heroic female figure for those of you who are women to really look up to. Certainly it's not Emma, right? So how many of you related to Nephi as a hero growing up as a kid? Raise your hand if you related to Nephi. He was the noble son, right? He was the righteous child. And how many of you felt like you were the Nephi in your family, to your parents, right? And one of the most devastating things that I've seen in these workshops and retreats is this very heartbreaking dilemma that people bring, which is, I love my dad or I love my mom, and I love having them adore me. And I really valued being viewed by my parents as the most righteous or faithful, as a super righteous and faithful kid. And one of the most difficult things about this faith crisis is I'm falling in status from these people who, honestly, my self-esteem and ego has largely been built upon, right? And it's devastating to my sense of self to be downgraded in value in their eyes. How many of you relate to that in some way? Okay, I call that the Nephi effect, and it is super, super difficult. And so the question is, what do you do if your faith crisis makes it so the people you love and care about most no longer respect and value you? And let's add to that. What if you actually are on the right side of truth and history? And what if actually your act of disaffiliating is an act of great courage and integrity that should be respected and honored, right? Isn't that an excruciating dilemma to be in? What is the way out? What in the world are you supposed to do with this scenario? So, I can tell you what you shouldn't do for sure, and then I can tell you a recommendation. What people often do is they're so unwilling to accept that downgrade in status, right? That demotion in respect, that they feel like what they need to do is have an extra sense of urgency to proselytize and convince their loved ones that they are on the side of truth and righteousness, right? It's like what they say is, I want you to know the truth. I want you to see the joy that I've seen. I want you to understand, so that you can live the life you want. But what you're really thinking and feeling is I don't want you to love me any less because I really enjoy your love and respect. And I need your love and respect, right? But what we forget is so oftentimes we're now going back to that issue, the backfire effect, because you want their love and respect, right? But what you end up wanting to do to maintain their love and respect is standing up in the boat and flailing your arms and shaking the boat that they are enjoying their ride in. And what you end up doing is, Eckhart Tolle has the idea that what you fight, you strengthen, and what you resist persists. And the stronger you fight to try and convince them that you're still that amazing child, you're still that Nephi, you're still that honorable son or daughter, the stronger you fight to force them to come around to your worldview, guess what you end up doing? Not only do you make them afraid and terrified and create the backfire effect, you're actually going to accelerate the demise of their esteem for you and make them respect and love you less, because you're going to go from Nephi to that ranty ex-Mormon Voldemort John Dehlin person, Korihor, right? You become Korihor. You go from Nephi to Korihor when you try and solve the problem this way. So if the answer isn't to fight for their respect and esteem, Because while they hold their worldview, it is probably irreconcilable for them to see you as noble and great and honest and amazing while you are abandoning everything that they know to be true and good and that they taught you. Because the most devastating thing of all for a parent, believe it or not, isn't that you leave the church. It's that they failed as a parent, and that's why you're leaving the church. That's really oftentimes psychologically what's behind their demotion in respect and value for you, is them feeling like they did a bad job as a parent. So this is hard. So what's the answer if it's not to fight to maintain their respect and their esteem? What do you have left to do? Is this an impossible dilemma? Are you just screwed?
That's a narcissistic perspective, though, with parents to say, make it about them. And they failed as a parent. Yeah. I was gonna say, I deal with this a lot, but it's a narcissistic perspective tendency of parents to say, oh, I must have been a horrible mother. I did something so wrong for you to leave the church. What did I do? And stuff like that, and making it about them instead of about you. It's not about them, it's about you and your choices.
Yeah. Here's the problem. A narcissistic system often breeds narcissistic parents. How many of you would call your parents or believing partners malignant narcissists? How many of you would say that was your experience? Okay, not all of you, but some. So yes, that's true, but you didn't quite answer my question, and I'm saying that playfully. What options do you have if your believing loved ones have lowered their esteem for you? What options do you have? Shout it out.
I left the church 24 years ago. My children suffered the Mormon, everybody's wonderful but your mom. I had to come to a point where I just loved and accepted them just as they are, and I supported them in their church activities. They knew where they standed, and I did a whole lot of crying and I still, to this day, am just starting to heal from that, but I wouldn't change my choice ever.
Let's give her applause. Because we're short on time and I want to give you one last hour with Steve, I'm going to jump to the answer that I'm wanting to offer. Loving and accepting is always the answer. Unconditional love is always the answer. What I'm moving to is one of the core concepts of Buddhism. Starts with an A. Acceptance. Okay? Like Eckhart Tolle says, what you fight, you strengthen. What you resist, persist. If you're trying to make them maintain or grow their respect for you, you're probably strengthening the outcome you don't want. You're probably creating resistance. So the key tenet of Buddhism is, and whoever came up with this idea, life is suffering, right? What an awful premise to a religious tradition. Life is suffering. But there's a psychological benefit to beginning with the premise that life is suffering, right? Because once you accept the suffering of life, right, that first arrow is always painful, but what you avoid, any of you listened to No Roshetta in secular Buddhism? When you learn to accept the first arrow, what do you avoid? The second arrow, and the third arrow, and the fourth arrow that you create by your unwillingness to accept what is. So I want to recommend secular Buddhism to all of you, and not as a religion, not even as a form of spirituality, but there's this core teaching in Buddhism called acceptance. What if you were to consider practicing acceptance that you have been downgraded for now in their eyes? And you just say, I am no longer daddy's special little girl in that same way for now. I'm no longer mommy's heroic Nephi right now. Imagine meditating that, imagining when you're suffering that your parents or spouse or kids no longer look up to you. Try something very, very revolutionary and different. which is just accepting that that is what the reality is right now. It may not always be permanent, right? It may change. But I promise you that resisting what is going to cause a lot more pain than practicing acceptance. And that's painful. I see some tears flowing right now as people contemplate no longer being viewed as special by their parents. And I don't mean to be glib about that, and I'm not trying to be disrespectful. But what I will offer as a final thought to that dilemma is this, that one of the challenges and opportunities of life is to mature and is to grow. And the extent to which your self-esteem is excessively tied to the esteem of your parents or to other loved ones is an opportunity for you to strengthen your esteem and your self-efficacy. Because the truth is, you have all done amazingly heroic things. You have honored your parents or your loved ones and your pioneer ancestry, by the way, by seeking truth and making sacrifices for truth. So whether or not your parents or your grandparents or your spouse or your kids honor and respect that journey, I would recommend it would be very valuable for you to do the work to get to the point where you value and respect the decisions and the journey that you've made, to the point where it doesn't matter to you whether your spouse or your children or your parents or your grandparents necessarily maintain that level of respect. You can get to the point where you feel so proud and so confident and so secure and so grateful for the courageous decisions that you've made, to where if your parents don't quite love you as much and you find out, you rip off the veneer and you find out a lot of these relationships were built on conditional love because that's what was offered to them and that's what they learned by their parents and by their church. It's hard to see that reality, but what you end up with is a rock solid confidence and self-efficacy that you are amazing and that you've done amazing things. And that's an opportunity for growth. It's hard, it's painful. I'm not trying to be glib and minimize the importance of those relationships, but it's an opportunity for growth that will pay very, very positive dividends for you in the long run. So I'm suggesting you consider acceptance of the esteem that may be lowered. Who was it that asked the original question? Thank you. You may have to work with a therapist or a coach to help you with that. I recommend the Secular Buddhism podcast. Steve, reactions?